welcome to this event, which is about reflecting on Blackstone's Tower. But I'm going to chair the first half of the event, which is basically a brief contribution from each of the speakers. And we decided that we wouldn't introduce ourselves all at the beginning because there's rather a lot of us. So we will introduce ourselves as we speak. So just to get on with my welcome, it's been a real pleasure to edit this special edition of Amicus Curiae. Emma and I would like to thank Professor Michael Palmer for inviting us to do the collection in the first place, and Professor William Twining for talking to us about his Hamlin lectures. We'd also like to thank Professor Carl Stitchin, the director of the Institute, for facilitating the event, as well as Daly Sarkos, who you will hear me talking to every now and again because she is facilitating the technical support today. So thank you very much. Of course, we'd also like to thank, Emma and I would like to thank the contributors who have all written such really varied and interesting articles. So just to remind you who they are, I'll do a quick trot through the list. So they are Professor Stephen Vaughan from UCL, Dr. Jess Guth, an independent researcher, Professor Anthony Bradney from Keele, Professor Richard Collier from Newcastle, Dr. Abigail Pearson from Keele, Professor Chris Ashford from Northumbria, Dr. Foluke Adebisi from Bristol, and Professor David Sugarman from Lancaster. We'll also hear from Professor Michael Palmer as the editor. And I'd just like to tell you all that, unfortunately, David Sugarman is suffering with his voice today. And so he's unable to speak, although he's here as a participant. But he sent me his presentation, and I'll read it out at the appropriate time and try to do justice to it. So at the end of the presentations, there will be an opportunity for questions and comments and discussion. And that will be chaired by my co-editor, Dr. Emma Jones. We hope you enjoy the event. And I'll now ask Professor Michael Palmer, the editor of Amicus Curiae, to start the proceedings.
Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Jolly good. I'm now quite experienced, but very untutored in Zoom. So I do press the wrong buttons from time to time and fail to find the right button quite often. Anyway, hi, I'm Mike Palmer, as Fiona said, editor of Amicus, and somebody who first met William Twining when we were both, as William characterized our team, academic tourists visiting Beijing University, China in late 1988 to give papers and to learn firsthand about the reviving Chinese legal system. Professor Twining was impressively quick to see the people's mediation, 人民调解, not the mirage of litigation, adjudication, and arbitration then dazzling the eyes of foreign investors, was and indeed remains at the heart of China's Zhengfa, or political legal system. I was impressed. So today, many thanks to Profs. Cowney, Jones, and Twining, to special issue contributors, you did the work, and to the School of Advanced Study in the Institute for carrying out, or at least aiding and abetting in some cases, this project and today's event. One of the main messages from the Tower was, of course, the need to understand better and to reflect more deeply on the institutional and ideological context within which we carry out the practice of teaching law in law schools. The Tower study may indeed be seen as a law school in context contribution. Arguably, and despite changing values, hopefully for the better, these contexts are on balance less favorable today than they were some 3 decades ago, hence the felt need for rethinking. Times are tough now. Many scholars feel uncomfortable with the changes being pressed on them. young scholars in particular feel they are underappreciated by their institutions, if they have one, and despair of an academic career. Relations between academic law and the legal professions are troubled. The meaning and value of the law degree is changing with the massification of the university, including especially law school education. Differing perceptions of the value of teaching and of research output continue to generate tensions within law schools, and CV19 has intruded more than somewhat. On the other hand, often aided by sociology and anthropology, we arguably have better appreciation of issues of gender, sexuality, disability, ethnicity, and race, and socioeconomic status, to give social class its respectable name, by democratizing processes which encourage party empowerment. And of the relationship between these social characteristics and education and educational opportunity. And ADR has taken root with its message that resolving differences and disagreements is often best done by democratizing processes which encourage party empowerment and self-determination. The use of ADR has grown in legal and non-legal practice, in the courts, and in law school teaching. But in some ways, ADR is being overtaken by an even faster galloper, namely ODR, including now, for example, Lord Briggs' vision of an online court. So it is indeed time for reflection and refurbishment, reflections on and refurbishment of the goals and practices of legal education, and to take inspiration from the insights offered in Blackstone's Tower so as to make law schools better places for all concerned, including the society within which they function. And I do think contributors to this special issue, as we shall soon hear, do indeed help us to understand better a number of the key issues just noted and which face us today in UK legal education. Blackstone's Tower was published at a time when I first became a head of law school. And the ideas which I generated by thinking and reflecting on the Tower were important in helping me address critical issues such as contradictions between law school direction and institutional demands for law school funds, between teaching of and research into English law on the one hand and of comparative and international law on the other, and so on. On a more personal level, and for which many thanks are due, Professor Twining encouraged me to work on dispute resolution, then a small and marginal field, and also comparative legal studies, including legal anthropology, at a time when the relevant committee for the University of London Intercollegiate LLM, which I think was a wonderful institution and which William contributed to greatly, that committee decided that comparative law was passé. Professor Twining has published much good work since Blackstone's Tower, and I recommend to everybody who hasn't encountered it yet his latest major study, namely the 2019 CUP book, Jurist in Context, the memoir. Yes, it is a memoir, but it is also what social research methodologists now like us to call autoethnography, qualitative research, in which the author uses self-reflection to explore anecdotal and personal experience, and to connect this experience with wider contexts. And Jurist in Context does this powerfully for the field of legal studies. And I would like to think that the observations shared with us in that study, in particular, ideas about how interests and insights are generated in an unfolding research agenda, will inspire many younger scholars in their legal studies work and encourage them to take a longer-term view of the important intellectual possibilities in their work and of the moral value of their work, despite the currently bumpy ride that many are experiencing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. So, Emma, would you like to go next?
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. When Fiona and I were invited to edit this special issue, we were delighted for a number of reasons, not least for me that I get to work with Fiona again. But one of those especially was the opportunity it gave us to revisit Professor Twining's work and consider not only its relevance at the time it was written, but also its contemporary resonance. The opening sentence of Blackstone's Tower states that the purpose of this book is to suggest that the study of law is becoming reabsorbed into the mainstream of our general intellectual life, as it was from Blackstone's time until the late 19th century, and that this is a welcome development. Now, my sense is that this could easily be set as an essay question for a student of legal education scholarship today, although no doubt now it would be framed within the context of the solicitor's qualifying examination, the marketisation of the law school, the ref and the TEF. It must be remembered that some of today's well-rehearsed debates on legal education were really in their infancy at the time that Blackstone's Tower was published. Although there is a long history of writing about legal education, often it was descriptive rather than analytical, doing something of a disservice to what should and can be a rich and important field of research. If understanding of legal education was arguably limited within the legal academy, it was even more limited amongst the general public, with both legal education and law generally being viewed as a somewhat specialist and opaque field. By acting as a tour guide to the fictitious University of Rutland Law School, Professor Twining dissects both the public and private life of this institution in a way which was, and still arguably is, radical, accessible, and illuminating. He is using the mundane and the minutiae in law school life and taking what he terms an institution's approach to shed light on its working. In doing so, he also achieves his stated overall purpose by giving a vision of law schools as what Professor Twining terms the legal system's house of intellect. A question that then arises is whether or to what extent legal education has changed since the publication of Blackstone's Tower. In a purely statistical sense, of course, we can identify change, with the popularity of the law degree seeming ever increasing, and as Michael just referred to, the massification of legal education. However, in our paper, Fiona and I suggest that adopting Professor Twining's institutions approach as a lens, any change has been relatively slow and minor. Changes to the design, delivery, and role of teaching have arguably been somewhat piecemeal and often driven by wider changes in the higher education sector. For example, the employability agenda driving a greater focus upon skills. The most significant shift is perhaps that of the past 18 months, when the onset of COVID-19 forced law schools, along of course with other parts of the university, into an online pivot. As we now consider the post-pandemic university, it will be interesting to see to what extent this leads to sustained and embedded change within legal education. In terms of legal education research, the volume of publications alone could perhaps be taken to imply that it is now flourishing and far more visible than in the era of Blackstone's Tower. This is promising, but in isolation, it does not necessarily speak to the quality of such outputs. In 2014, the REF Subpanel for Law noted that they were pleased to receive submissions relating to legal education, but the methodological rigour and significance exhibited by some of these outputs was uneven. Some research in legal education, as in education generally, remains descriptive and over-reliant on a case study approach, which fails to analyse the wider implications of innovations and changes. There is a need, then, for legal education and scholarship to continue to grow and develop. However, there is also a need for those assessing such research, and indeed the wider legal academy, to acknowledge the interdisciplinary nature of such work and the valuable new knowledge it can and does demonstrate when done well. We believe this special issue contributes to this aim by showcasing research on legal education, which examines Blackstone's Tower through the lens of the contemporary law school. In doing so, it not only explores key themes within the book itself, but it also highlights and discusses emerging areas not included within it, from decolonising the curriculum to the student experience. We hope that it can demonstrate the vitality which can and should be attached to legal education research and build upon the radical and significant work undertaken by Professor Twining.
Thank you very much, Emma. So, Stephen, if you'd like to speak next.
Thank you, Fiona, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. I very clearly remember reading Blackstone's Tower for the first time when I was asked to write a paper on legal education as part of a postgrad teaching qualification at Cardiff University. At that point, I was a solicitor, a former solicitor, and partway through my PhD. And it was no secret, I think, that I was given that lectureship at Cardiff because the powers that be thought that I could teach company law, given my professional background, when in fact I'd never studied company law, nor was it part of my professional practice. And before I wrote that essay and before I read Blackstone's Tower, I'd never really had cause to think about legal education or the academy in any substantive fashion, despite having a law degree and despite having taught various subjects at different law schools for a number of years. Blackstone's Tower was quite simply a revelation, and this well-thumbed copy covered in post-its has been on my bookshelf ever since. Now, I wanted to start my 5 minutes by telling you that story because I was genuinely touched when Fiona and Emma asked me to be a part of this special issue, and when William, who is now my colleague at UCL, was so very generous with his time in talking to me about a draft of my contribution. So this book and William's contributions on legal education more generally have a very special place in my own career and my own academic interests. So for this special issue, Fiona and Emma asked me to write about the relationship between the legal academy and the legal profession. And to do that, I borrowed an approach from chapter 4 of Blackstone's Tower, in which William, as a tour guide, explores Rutland as a case study on law school culture. And Rutland University is what he beautifully labels a mythical middling law school in Middle England. So in my paper, which is titled Rutland Revisited, I adopted a very similar narrative style and created a number of my own fictitious universities and other organizations. And as William had done in chapter 4 of Blackstone's Tower, the ideas and the data to which my paper speaks are partly drawn from a whole series of existing studies on the legal profession and on the legal academy, and also on legal education. So I think my paper has two core themes and makes two big sets of claims. The first is that despite the many, many significant changes since Blackstone's Tower, the legal academy generally venerates the institution of the legal profession, with my view being that that veneration is both misguided and one-sided, and that the legal profession is generally largely apathetic about the academy. What I've also suggested in my contribution is that the many interfaces that we see between the legal academy and the legal profession are almost always ad hoc. How many law schools, for example, have an explicit strategy which sets out their relationships with practicing lawyers? And where those strategies exist, how many of them are in substance about anything much more than income generation? The second large theme that runs through my contribution speaks to my concerns, and they are concerns, about how law schools sell the profession to prospective students. I think there's an ongoing path dependency of the academy on the profession that harks back partly to much smaller law student numbers, and also to a stronger alignment some time ago between law degrees as the first steps for legal practice. But the fact that law schools sell the profession is, I think, also partly about kudos and about image. We legal academics want lots of students to study law at university, and we want good students to study law at university. Numbers and quality being not unimportant indicators when law school heads and deans are jostling in a tournament of influence with their dean and head peers in front of their vice chancellors. It also helps us, I think, as academics, that we don't have perfect or great or good or really very much data on what our students go on to do after they study law with us. So we find it very hard to articulate in any depth a response to the question, well, exactly how many of your final year LLB graduates go on to qualify as solicitors or barristers within X years of graduation, and what sort of work do they do, et cetera, et cetera. It also seems, I think, to have passed us by that collecting that sort of data is well within our gift. So my contribution to this special issue is unapologetically pessimistic, and also in many parts intentionally quite unkind to legal academics. My main concern, I think, is that there is a return to conservatism among the majority of legal academics, or perhaps some combination of conservatism, path dependency, and lack of interest, and also where that conservatism may be even greater than that set out by William in Blackstone's Tower so many years ago. Let me end, however, on a slightly more positive note. So I suggest there's a shadow in my work that is cast by the legal profession on the legal academy, but it is simply that. It is just a shadow and nothing more substantial. And so I think we need to have a little bit more confidence about our place, even if the vast majority of our students do not go on to become regulated members of the legal profession, and the data tells us they do not. We need to remember that what we do as legal scholars, as legal educators, has value that transcends the production of practice-ready graduates. And I think we can and should be better about articulating that value to ourselves, to our current and prospective students, within our own institutions, and much further afield. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That's great. So, Jess, would you like to go next?
I will, as soon as I can get my video working. There we go. Well, thanks very much for having me. I too want to start with a little personal story in the same or similar way that Stephen did, which is that really when I was thinking about this paper, I thought back to my open day, my university open days when I was looking to where to study. And I prompted that thinking, and I was thinking about a sort of paper quite a long time before Fiona and Emma asked me to contribute to this special issue. And that was because I went for a run when I was in the city where I was an undergraduate, and I happened to run across campus. And the thing that struck me about the campus as it was sort of 25 years later nearly was the lack of space. And I remember thinking that one of the reasons I'd chosen that particular university as one of my options was because of the sense of space on campus. And I'd sort of forgotten about that thinking and that experience until Emma and Fiona asked me to think about what the student perspective might look like when considering Blackstone's Tower. It was also a lovely excuse to go back to the book and reread the book, which I hadn't picked up for quite some time. And I hadn't really remembered or registered that actually the student voice doesn't feature all that heavily in the book. I kept looking through thinking, have I missed something? There are some pages that give us some insight to students, but not actually that much. So that prompted me then to think about what's the experience like when you go and look at a place from a student perspective? What are the things that were shown to me when I was a prospective law student walking around campus? And how does that look differently now? So when I go around different campuses now, obviously I see them from a slightly different perspective, but also I think different things are emphasised and jump out at you. And that was really the starting point for this paper in my thinking. And I'd like to just really formally thank Emma and Fiona for helping me finish this paper when my brain was not in a particularly good place, and I'd sort of got to a point with it where I didn't know what to do with it. And they sort of wrestled it off me and turned it into the contribution that it is, and I think it's all the better for it. So thank you very much to you two. So in the paper, which also takes the approach of a tour around the sort of Rutland several years later, the first thing that jumped out at me in my thinking was that I don't remember the student ambassadors from when I was walking round, which would have only been about 2 years after the book was published. We were led around by students, but they weren't these sort of branded student ambassadors. And also, we could move around the campus really freely. There were no electronic key cards, there were no parking permits to be got in advance. There were no badges to be worn while on campus to show that you've got the status of an approved visitor. And then I think when I started my tour and all the tours that I remember from being a prospective student, they sort of focused on the law school quite quickly. Whereas all of the tours that I'm sort of aware of now take in the whole campus, tend to start with the shiny buildings, finish in the moot courtroom, which is, the thing that everybody wants to see. Even though actually in the life of the student when they're at the university, that might not feature very much at all. I think the other theme in that contribution is that now there's a real focus on services, showing off the services. I don't remember a single tour where we might have stopped off at a counselling service or a wellbeing service. It was essentially student union, here's where you get your beer, here's the library, and here's the actual law school. And that was kind of it. Whereas now there's an increasing focus on showing the hub, or whatever it's called, on your particular campus, where there's the well-resourced careers service, where there's the wellbeing service that you might be ushered past a little faster. But there's also academic support that is often really noticeably less well-resourced than the careers service. And the whole thing has the kind of feel of being guided through something by quite a well-rehearsed and well-oiled marketing machine. And eventually you get to the library, which, I like libraries that have books in. You can see some books behind me. That seems to not be the norm now. So lots of university libraries don't have that many books. They're sort of tucked away in the corner. They have study spaces for individuals, for groups. I mean, it struck me that the description of the law library in Blackstone's Tower is really quite different to the law library that we now see. But that actually William made the prediction that the digital library was very much upon us. And I think he was absolutely right in that. The other theme that sort of runs through, but is perhaps less explicit in the contribution, is that we use space slightly differently now than we perhaps used to, that students use the spaces differently, and that they gather together in the library when that was something that was absolutely not possible when I was a student. You could not do group work in a library, for example. But that there's more social space and flexible learning space throughout the campus overall. So one of the main points I think that the contribution makes, sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek as we move through it, is that the student voice has become much more prevalent. It has to, because of the way that we have to sell our courses, and what the students think and whether they're happy is important in that kind of marketing machine. And so our guide is kind of making that voice a little bit more heard, a little bit more explicit in relation to Blackstone's Tower. But I think the next step that we now need to take is take the marketing varnish off that student voice and actually look at what a less polished, less rehearsed kind of student tour around a law school might actually look like. And I guess that's a project for another day.
Thank you very much indeed, Jess. So, Tony, if you'd like to speak next.
Thank you very much. The image of the tower has had potent symbolic significance in many cultures over many centuries. In my contribution to this collection, I've looked at 3 different images of the tower. Montaigne's tower, which I'll start with, is a real tower. It's the tower which Montaigne had refurbished to enable him to write what eventually became his book Essays, a study he describes as his private family matter. His essays, however, were to have much more impact than his public political role, even though that included being mayor of Bordeaux and mediating in the many religious disputes of his era. Montaigne's tower is of pragmatic importance for academics. What did he think was necessary for his writing? First, a study. Like Virginia Woolf, he needed a room of his own in which to write. Secondly, a library. He had a considerable collection of books, over 1,000 for his time. This can seem anachronistic now when we all have in our offices and in our private homes electronic access to huge libraries via the internet. And yet COVID has demonstrated how important control of our own books is. Universities have calmly closed offices, denying academics access to their own books. I have not seen my books in Kiel since last October. But the pragmatic significance of Montaigne's Tower is less important than its symbolic importance. In his essays, Montaigne wrote, "We should set aside a room just for ourselves and establish there our true liberty, our principal solitude, and asylum." As Martin Trowell writes, in days of mass higher education, academics work at home. The second image of the tower is the Tower of Babel. Now, the Tower of Babel has its origins in Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 to 9, and slightly differently in Josephus's book, Antiquities of the Jews. But in both, the human race decides to build a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. God, displeased by this, introduces a multiplicity of languages to human beings, and the building of the tower fails. And one standard interpretation of this idea of the Tower of Babel, what Hibbert calls the pride and punishment story, is that we should be aware of arrogance, pride, and hubris, and the need to avoid these. And its application to universities is straightforward. Do not promise what you cannot deliver, something that UK universities seem to have forgotten as they buy into the Making Britain greater mantra, guaranteeing graduates fulfilling well-paid jobs, etc., etc. However, there is another possible interpretation of the Tower of Babel. The tower is about human ambition, the scale of human ambition, and this ambition is not necessarily scolded. The theologian Niebuhr wrote, "Man builds towers of the spirit. This is a necessary human ambition." Research, work which attempts to move from the known to the unknown, is a tower of the spirit. Is knowledge transfer a suitable ambition for a university? Is impact a tower of the spirit? Is that something we really should be striving for? And my final tower, the Ivory Tower, very frequently referred to in debate, both inside and outside the academy, as any Google search will tell you. Whether people know what they're referring to is doubtful. The French critic, Sainte-Beuve, first says of Alfred de Vigny that he has withdrawn to his ivory tower. Now, is this a description or is this condemnatory in what he's saying? Scholars disagree. Flaubert writes to Turgenev, "I've always tried to live in an ivory tower." The Zimbabwean novelist Marachera writes, "The writer has no duty, no responsibility other than his art. Integrity demands the ivory tower. There is more reality in the ivory tower than there is outside. The ivory tower can serve as a reliable watchtower." Each individual academic has to decide what their own preferred tower or towers is. Academic freedom is not a right, it's an obligation. We have to make our own decision about what it is that we should do, which tower we should live in, and then defend our choice as best we can. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tony. So, Richard, would you like to speak?
Yeah, well, hello, everybody, and I hope you're all really well. And Emma, Fiona, thank you for asking me to contribute to this collection. Very brief background to my paper. The well-being of lawyers has become the subject of a now vast and rapidly growing body of research and data sets internationally, but increasingly in the UK as well. And Emma and I, in different networks and projects, have been working in this area. My chapter, though, in contrast, and in the context of our discussion of Blackstone's Tower, explores well-being in another part of the legal community, university law schools. In a nutshell, well-being is a topic I'd suggest that it would be impossible to avoid in any tour of a contemporary law school, or indeed in any discussion of the higher education sector. And Jess made reference to this in her tour earlier. Prior to COVID, we were already seeing discussion about a crisis of student well-being and mental health, how well-being might be integrated into the mission statement, strategic priorities, dedicated charters of universities, and so on. In the case of law students, all of that is underscored by an explosion of work over the past decade on law student well-being, encompassing concerns around, for example, law and emotion.
Richard?
It just took me on meeting there. I hope you didn't caught some of that. How and whether we should be educating for well-being, embedding wellness through intentional design, and so on. But the focus of this chapter is a little different, because there is another subject that is now receiving increasing attention across disciplines. And although law has lagged behind fields like geography and sociology, we now have a distinct strand of scholarship on a subject that I suggest would have barely featured in any tour of the law school at the time of Blackstone's Tower, and that is the well-being of legal academics. And I'm going to link back to Michael's introduction here and some themes. So what does the chapter do? Against the backdrop of what's become known as critical university studies, which has placed well-being at the centre of a debate about what the good university, to follow Raewyn Connell, could and should be, I look at the evolution of this concern about legal academic well-being in the days since Blackstone Tower. And I chart those changes, which were certainly underway at the time of its publication, which have transformed the higher education sector. And like others, I bring in aspects of my own experience here over the past 30 years. So 4 brief arguments to give a flavour. 1, albeit that it's inflected by concerns that resonate in different ways across disciplines, the research and data sets on the emotional and affective consequences of the marketisation of higher education suggest that the practices, structures and cultures of contemporary universities are enmeshed with the concerns that we're now seeing about well-being and mental health. And I think there is a lot more to that than this familiar discussion of metric assemblages, forms of performance management, new forms of governance, and so on. 2, we know much more now about how well-being is mediated by social class, gender, race, sexuality, health, and disability. But there is a striking absence here, and that is the issue of the life course. And this is a gap both in the lawyer well-being research and the work on legal academics. And yet I would argue, and I hope this chimes with William's account here and elsewhere of this personal odyssey of a legal academic or a wandering jurist, our subjective experiences in organisations over time intersect with life course transitions and ageing as an embodied process, which must be situated in specific social economic contexts. 3, well-being has become part of the politics of resistance in the field of higher education. An example, autoethnographical work was referred to earlier. Well, what you see there are attempts to talk back to audit culture by making visible the subjective anxieties that have become part of these structures of feelings of universities. Do what the well-being narrative says. Speak out, speak about well-being, challenge stigma, and that's what's going on. 4, and finally, what I think we've got at the present moment is an array of issues and debates, diverse questions, the future and purpose of legal education, the conditions of academic work, and they're all coming under this well-being umbrella. In such a context, it seems to me that COVID-19 may represent a paradigm shift, because this is an engagement with well-being and mental health that is not going to go away in the years to come. And I think it's going to become increasingly central to what law schools actually do. A final aside, I hope I've not gone over 5 minutes. It's a long time since I've been to a conference now, but the last one I went to pre-COVID, I remember walking back from conference dinner, leading legal academic, a major figure in our field, who was reflecting very openly and honestly on their own career. And they said, when I was starting out, this idea of well-being or how we talk about mental health. It just didn't feature. We just got on with it. And it's a sign of the change that's happened, is that I think this question of well-being is all around us now. It pervades us. It was there in our exam boards recently. The problem is that much of the time we're not clear what we mean by well-being or whose well-being it is we're actually talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's great. Thank you. So, Abigail.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes, I'm sure we can.
Okay, I'm just checking because I don't do so well with the buttons on Zoom. Right. So, yes, my contribution to this issue, and thank you very much to both Fiona and Emma for asking me to join, is based on my PhD research and also some additional CEDA-funded research into how to increase access for students with disabilities within higher education more generally for the CEDA funded part, but focusing on the law school because I work in the law school, and also that I have experience myself of having been a student with a disability in the law school. And one of the things which I found very interesting about Blackstone's Tower when I first started to read it as part of my PhD research was the conversation that was had about the library at Rutland and the focus on things like the rickety lift, the inaccessible text books and things and stuff like that. And that was written about in 1994 prior to the creation of the DDA in 1995 and the developments that came in from 2005 onwards, which began to increasingly focus on access to higher education for students with disabilities. And the other thing which we notice when we look at these discussions is that when people turn to look at access, there's also a sense of anxiety around access, not only from a student point of view of will I be able to access the resources I need to study, but also from a staff point of view about how do I assist my students in being able to study and what is our legal position both as institutions and individuals. And yet, despite this, there's been little focus in terms of curriculum content and things like that about teaching about equalities within the law school. So making it part of the curriculum and the student experience and learning development, if you like. Now that is gradually starting to change with things like Let's Get Disability on the List at Oxford. And there are, of course, various specialised institutes. So University of Lancaster has a good one, as does University of Leeds. However, I thought it would be interesting to think about how the mainstreaming of those discussions could help with those anxieties on both sides. But I also thought it was very interesting that Blackstone's Tower was hinting at these issues that people faced without necessarily fitting them within the discourse of disability. And that's it.
Thanks very much indeed, Abigail. That's great. So, Chris Ashford, would you like to talk next?
Absolutely. And let me start, as others have done, by thanking Fiona and Emma for pulling together this brilliant collection. And I'm in absolute awe of the company that I'm in this special issue. My article focuses on gender sexuality in the law school and seeks to rethink Blackstone's Tower with queer and feminist theory. Blackstone's Tower was, of course, published in 1994, and if you go back to its 244 pages, you'll find feminism is mentioned twice, Queer, which was still very much emergent in 1994, isn't referenced at all. And perhaps that's unsurprising, given that term was still a pejorative term for many people when used in everyday language. And queer theory within the academy was very much emerging. This perhaps underscores the transformation in law schools since 1994. Progress on women's rights, for instance, has been arguably restrained. The landmark appointment of Brenda Hale, first woman president of the UK Supreme Court in 2017, is a notable exception. Tierney and Dilley have noted that the significant shift in social and cultural attitudes has provided a new visibility to sexuality and created a new landscape for research into sex and sexuality. So as we have pieces of legislation, like more recently same-sex marriage in many jurisdictions, including in England and Wales, then that sets in train a whole set of legal research around that institution and what that means for individuals. And we can look at various legal advancements and the way that that has almost thrown a stone into the lake of academia to create this extra scholarship around gender, sexuality, and law. So we're seeing a growing problematization of the relationship between LGBTQ people and the law. Projects such as No Outsiders in schools are driving a transformation in school pedagogy. And also, as we've seen in Birmingham in the last couple of years, also controversy, also reaction to that. And again, that played out just last week in the Batley and Spen by-election, where you saw those issues raised. Twining has suggested that the English Law School was still coming of age back in 1994, but he also notes later in Blackstone's Tower that the law school of that time was excluding outsiders. Perhaps the law school had not yet sufficiently matured, you might assume from that. But of course, that would presume a neutrality, an idea that to wait is in itself a neutral action. We'll get to the gender agenda, we'll get to the sexuality agenda. I think that's problematic for many queer and feminist thinkers, and that's one of the ideas that I explore in this article. Both feminists and queer theorists, I think, would reject this assumption that we can wait. The urgency of engagement with issues of gender and sexuality that these theoretical strands inject into the law school should not be underestimated, I would argue. And indeed, these ideas offer an opportunity to tear down the very walls of Blackstone's decidedly phallic Tower. And in the article, I do have a bit of fun with Blackstone's Tower on a slightly different track to Tony Bradney, but I'll leave that for you to read in the article. Similarly, this idea that feminist or queer theory is a bolt-on or an interesting addition rather than as a central philosophical worldview, I think is also problematic. Where is the feminist or the queer law school? Perhaps Kent comes close to that in terms of feminism, but we don't see the same coalescence of queer scholarship either in England and Wales or across the UK, but also in the US, where there is a strong presence of queer theory in law schools. Of course, this idea of the outsider that William touched upon in the law school is also problematic for feminists and queer theorists. I'm thinking here of Bruce Bower's 1994 work, looking at A Place at the Table, same year as Blackstone Tower was published, in which Bower questions this idea that do we even want a place at the table, or do we actually want to remake the table? Do we want to remake this object, this institution in which we operate? And it's this utopian idea that I develop a little bit further in the article, and like Stephen and like Jess touched on, revisit Rutland and seek to queer Rutland. The other themes that I touch on in the article are the idea of what gender and sexuality means for the law school agenda. We've seen growing engagement with feminist and queer research in recent years, but teaching has been slower, and William touches on some of the reasons around that in Blackstone's Tower, around this lag on teaching versus research. We have seen in recent years, though, growing visibility to gay students on campus. We can see scholarship going back to the late 70s in the US, and particularly in the 1980s. We've seen people like Ruth Ann Robson noting the queering of the legal academy in the US. And in this jurisdiction, we've seen more recently LGBT moots. We've seen feminist and queer zine projects mirroring a lot of the work that happened in the 1980s in the US. And we've also seen growing legal employment-focused networks emerging for students, particularly in relation to women and LGBT groups. When it comes to GSL teaching, the teaching of gender, sexuality and law, that has, I think, developed much later, but has developed at pace in recent years. We've seen the Feminist Legal Judgments Project, I think, is a notable example here, in which these offer an opportunity to reread law and for our students to reread law and to approach law in a different way. We've seen gender, sexuality and law modules, gender modules, sexuality modules increasingly emerge within law schools. And I think even before those modules, people have been teaching these themes. If I can riff on the autoethnography themes that people have already touched on, when I started teaching, I was teaching human rights courses, I was teaching IT law courses, but in all of those, I was teaching very similar topics to those that I now teach in the context of gender, sexuality and law. It's just that we found places to put those ideas. Twining in Blackstone's Tower described his newspaper exercise that many of you will be familiar with, and he looks at a series of events in January 1994 and describes how he uses this exercise with students to look at the law in context. And as he goes through these events from that particular day in the newspaper, he also touches on the story of Lorena Bobbitt. Now, some of you might remember Lorena Bobbitt. This was a woman who cut off her husband's penis with a knife. She drove off in her car and she threw his penis into a field. She then told the police where she'd thrown the penis. The penis was retrieved by the police and was reattached to her husband, John. Now, as soon as I saw that in Williams' text, my mind drifted back to 1994. And at the time of that story in January, I was 13. And I remember this instance as kind of the joke in the playground. It was all over the news. And it was a funny story. Indeed, William Twining concludes that section by saying this looked like a fairly typical day. So I don't know what was going on in William's life in January 1994, but there we go. Of course, we can joke about these things, but would we today? That humour, that easy way in which we can kind of find it amusing, perhaps, and the way that Bobbitt appeared on T-shirts and slogans and the butt of jokes on humour shows, would that happen today? Well, if we add the context that we now understand around Lorena Bobbitt, which is that she was someone who'd suffered multiple rapes from her husband, years of gender-based violence, and indeed has gone on to be a gender violence campaigner. I think we would approach that entire story very differently from a feminist perspective in law schools. And I think it underscores the way that feminism has started to impact on law schools and impacted on the way that we can revisit law and view law in context in a different way. The law teacher, of course, has started telling more stories about women law teachers. Fiona Cowney's work from 2004 is an obvious example, so too Celia Wells' 2019 text. Sex and sexuality has perhaps been less documented in this area. Eric Rofes, an educator, wrote way back in 2000 about queer identities in education and noted that sex is actually an integral part alongside sexual desire to the way that we think about people who are gay and lesbian in law schools. And that, of course, means that for students, they can immediately view that individual with a sexual identity, something that is perhaps still very uncomfortable for law schools to talk about. What happens if they see that academic on Grindr or Recon, which is a kink dating app? What if they see that that person is into rubber or leather or fetish gear? What if they see their sexual preferences, the types of sex that they have, the tribes in which they identify within the LGBT community? These remain uncomfortable and challenging questions for the law school. As I say, the final theme that I then move on to is this idea of queering Rutland and exploring feminist and queer theory in the law school. And to conclude, the paper ultimately draws upon the utopian visions that both feminist theory and queer theory offer us to argue not simply for an updating of Blackstone's Tower, but for a fundamentally new world.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. Foluke, would you like to speak?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Grand. So good evening, and thank you to everyone for coming. I always feel awkward when I begin to speak, so I'm just going to jump into it. I want to thank Emma and Fiona especially for inviting me to contribute to this special issue, to this collection. I also want to thank them for their care and support on this journey from idea to publication. It has been a really great experience working with them, as everyone else has mentioned. When they invited me, they asked me to speak about, to write about decolonizing the curriculum or the law school curriculum based on my own work in that area and how my work in that area overlaps with the ever-changing ideas of what it means to be human and live in human society. So one of the major stares I gave myself was to try and address this overlap, or I would say almost conflict or confusion between decolonization and diversity. So trying to distinguish them quite firmly in the article. From Roads Must Fall to Coastal actually falling in the last few years, the idea of decolonizing the curriculum has taken off in UK higher education and beyond it. So as someone who had already been working on decolonization and race, both concepts very broadly framed, I very often received questions about what those discourses meant for our curricula in law schools within the context of us trying to decolonize the curriculum. These conversations and questions were also catalyzed by the introduction of the SQE. The challenge against this background was to figure out what law schools were for now and in the future if they were not for the making of lawyers, or in this case, solicitors. It is at the juncture of these conversations that my article was born. So it should be noted that I did not set out to write a how to decolonize guide. I don't find them useful or helpful or even possible. It is also not a summary of decolonial thought, though in the article I mentioned that on one end of the spectrum, decolonization, mainly articulated by post and anti-colonial scholars from Asia and Africa, seeks to repair the remnants of the colonial project as they appear and reappear in epistemic, political, legal, and economic structures. And at the other end of that, decolonial scholars, mainly from the Americas, and indigenous scholars from Oceania and also the Americas, seek to identify and dismantle the permanence of the aforementioned colonial project and to build in its place flourishing planetary futures, or as they term, worlds otherwise. Nevertheless, the literature and context of decolonial thought are vast and varied, and by design cannot be confined into one text. It would have been futile and presumptuous of me to attempt it or to suggest that I could even do so. So what I have attempted to do in this article is to rethink what and who law schools are for, based on the very different social realities and realizations that the world exists in now. The world into which our law students are entering, whether or not they choose to go into the legal profession, the world itself is plagued with social injustice. This social injustice operates or is unveiled along and enfolded in racial, gendered, class, sexuality, ability, and many other lines. There is also massive global inequality, extreme poverty, and environmental degradation. So are we equipping our students to understand, address, and respond to these challenges? Especially those students who come to the law school wanting to change the world and become disillusioned along the way. That was definitely my experience of law school, and speaking to students across the years of my teaching at law schools, this has been quite evidently a lot of students experience. We could suggest that legal education opens our students' eyes to the true nature of the law, especially where the focus of legal education is on black letter law or doctrinal law. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the common law is not a brooding omnipresence in the sky, but the articulate voice of some sovereign. Their disillusion, mine included, could be suggested is caused by our false expectations of what we think the law can do. However, the statement by Wendell Holmes not only tells us what is, but tells us what is possible. If law is formed, it can be reformed. Therefore, I argue in the article that if we lose sight of the transformative purposes of legal education, we lose sight of the beauties of human possibility. We run the risk of shoring up a decadent discipline. Disciplinary decadence, as articulated by Lewis Gordon, sets in because we treat our discipline as though it was never born, has always existed, will never change, or in some cases die, which means that very little change is being brought about, or very little change happens within legal education, despite the world around legal education, within the profession and beyond the profession, being in a state of constant flux. Legal education seems to be stuck and not effect the change which people seem to believe that it should bring about. Therefore, we need and we should look beyond diversity and representation for justice. We need to reconsider where our discipline has been, what it is now, and its endless and infinite possibilities. So I focus there in the article on law's alignment with long-standing patterns of power, especially as they are exemplified by coloniality. Coloniality, as described by Maldonado Torres, is different from colonialism. So coloniality refers to the patterns of power which precede and exist beyond the event of colonization. And this concept of coloniality produces most of the challenges which I mentioned earlier. So I ask then, as a staring point before and after the writing of the article, what is the future of legal education in a world yearning for change? What is the future of legal education in a world in the eye of storms of change? As legal academics, will we be part of this change, or will we be swept away by it? The concept of disciplinary decadence suggests that if we do not change, then the world will change without us and we will be relegated to obsolescence. So maybe decolonial thought gives us the room to begin to rethink the world anew. Maybe. I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Feluke. That's great. So our next contribution is by David Sugarman. Now, unfortunately, David has some problems with his voice at the moment and is unable to present this afternoon. But he's sent me his presentation and I will start my video. And so I'm going to present for him. I hope that I do it justice because David has kindly joined us this afternoon as a member of the audience. So thank you very much for that, David. And I hope I'm going to do my best to do you justice. So this is called Twining's Tower and the Challenges of Making Law a Humanistic Discipline. So David says, my brief was to survey William's life and scholarship, focusing largely on his contribution to legal education. Hence, my paper examines his background, his gurus, his career, and his scholarship, notably his struggle to recast law as a humanistic discipline. It also considers the current efficacy of law schools as purveyors of humanistic education, and it is this that I will focus on this afternoon. William's trailblazing contribution to the broadening of legal education and scholarship has been pivotal. In overarching conception, it can be regarded as a single enterprise, one which has no equal as a systematic account of the limitations and potential of legal education and scholarship. His contribution is like a palace whose architects altered their plans while building it, leaving structural inconsistencies that have made it occasionally labyrinthine, but not less splendid, housing room after room of paintings in different genre, each magical and challenging. As with any hermitage, there is no way of appreciating so much all at once. Repeated visits are needed, not least because, like all good art and scholarship, it provokes dispute. So where, almost 2 decades since the publication of Blackstone's Tower, stands the notion of law schools as purveyors of humanistic education? Today, academic law in the UK is livelier and more diverse than ever, as this afternoon's papers amply demonstrate. Law and socio-legal review articles and textbooks have come a long way since the 1960s. Although socio-legal studies has yet to become an accepted and established feature of all university law schools, it nonetheless is flourishing as never before. At its best, addressing big questions of identity and power, for example, on a much greater scale than hitherto. In addition, the interdisciplinary turn has constituted a dangerous supplement to the doctrinal mainstream, whilst fostering closer ties between law schools and the rest of the university. And yet, much of William's vision remains unfulfilled. Law schools and legal scholarship are still overwhelmingly preoccupied with doctrine, case law, and the judge-centred model of the legal process. The core subjects remain greatly overrepresented in the curriculum. The tendency towards organisational, cultural, demographic, and financial homogeneity within the discipline of law persists, as does its dependence on student numbers and tuition income. Law schools, like the universities and the societies within which they operate, continue to be hierarchical and ethnocentric. So despite important changes since the 1990s, much remains the same. Importantly, the conditions that sustain current models of university legal education have remained constant, notably student demand and finance, the cost of education, and the need for legal education to be sufficiently harmonious with the interests of the legal profession, of their principal clients, of universities and government. Innovation in legal education operates within these confines, and most are beyond the control of legal academics. The restructuring of universities and academic identities by corporatization and commodification has been problematic, and for most of us, extremely disquieting. These alienating tendencies have been replicated in the legal services industry. Although fewer law students than ever are entering the legal profession, the environment within which lawyers practice is important. In the precincts of ordinary law practice, tolerance for anything but the most minimal notion of law as a humanistic discipline is at what may be a historic low, creating a very hostile climate for self-critical reformist lawyers who are committed to reflection on the broader context and objectives of practice and to making the law operate more efficiently and justly. Meanwhile, the perennial clash between what students want and expect and what their students want to give them has probably intensified as the financial cost of higher education, the level of student debt, and job insecurity have all mushroomed. Given this challenging and paradoxical juncture, a reconsideration and re-evaluation of Blackstone's Tower is especially timely. This afternoon's event is also testimony to the enormous patrimony that William has given to us. He has inspired many, myself included, by doggedly and perceptively giving voice to our baffling disillusionment with our own legal education, to why law is important and fascinating, and how it might achieve its potential. If you will pardon the analogy with pop music, you, William, sang the blues at a time when much English legal scholarship resembled the unremittingly white popular music of the early 1950s. For this, and your many other contributions to the field, we owe you a huge debt of gratitude. Thank you. So, I'm now going to turn to William Twining to ask him to make his contribution.
It's all a bit overwhelming. I would blush if I could. And what can I say in 15 minutes? Well, first, many thanks and congratulations to everyone who's been involved. The organisers, the editors, the contributors, the impresarios, and of course, all the people behind the scenes. This is a very impressive symposium, both about change and the situation today, perhaps a little bit less about the future. And I'd like to take the opportunity to give everlasting thanks to all my colleagues and friends in the academic legal profession who've helped to make my life worthwhile. I started work on Blackstone's Tower in 1991, delivered the manuscript in 1993, although what was said earlier suggests that it actually lapped over into 1994, so my memory may be at fault. So there's an almost 30-year gap. And of course, in that time, the world, this country, global issues, legal services, and the many contexts, practices, and concerns of legal educators have all changed, although some of you have noted, some of it is still rather constant. And more important, perhaps, as Richard Susskind has predicted, the extent and rate of change have accelerated and will very probably continue to do so. I also have changed. Physically, some, and even my mind has changed a bit. But there are also some continuities from Blackstone's Tower. Fortunately, this symposium is not about Blackstone's Tower or about me. It's about the 30-year gap and the situation today. I'm a relic, and I'm not really qualified to talk about most of the papers. It's illustrated by the fact that I'm familiar with less than 30% of the references in this cornucopia of papers, many of which are multidisciplinary. So what can I say in what I think is now 12 minutes? Well, I think you've been too kind to Blackstone's Tower. A wee whiff of de mortuis about the contributions. But I'm still alive and stirring, and I haven't finished yet. And so I'll try to write the balance a little bit in three ways. First, some mea culpas. Second, the need to treat the academic legal profession as a collectivity with some responsibilities, as well as a bunch of individualistic free specialists. And third, I think the situation is rather less depressing than some of you have made out. First, mea culpas. Even in 1993, I could probably should have said more about student experience, attitudes, and culture, and about issues of disability, gender, access, diversity, and even post-colonialism were on some of the agendas. And also about some other topics dealt with by the commentators, which were just beneath my radar. My excuse is that my main focus was elsewhere. But clearly, most of these are relevant to that focus. Also, I may have been over-optimistic about some things, as Fiona and Emma suggest. But maybe some commentators have been unduly pessimistic about other issues. The main point of the mea culpas is that I could not even start to write Blackstone's Tower today, even if age and ignorance did not preclude it. The main weakness is that most of the book focuses on university law schools as institutions. That flies in the face of two mantras that we have nearly all paid lip service to, but remain largely ignored. First, that learning is a lifelong process, and that legal education, practice, research, and discourse should be focused on learning more than teaching. Sure, some attention has now been paid to learning theory and other developments in education, psychology, uses of technology, and so on. But the focus of research, debate, and concern is still very largely on primary legal education in university law schools. University law schools provide only a small, though important part of formal learning and teaching of and about law. Law is taught in many other institutions, from business and engineering schools to education of the police, judges, and school children. My next point is that the academic legal profession should collectively, as professional educators, take some responsibility for the health of all these other institutions that have substantial programs concerning law. Most of these are almost invisible in the current literature on legal education. Now, that point might seem radical to academic lawyers nurtured in the 1990s or before. It looks a bit cautious in light of the other mantra. Take lifelong learning seriously. But if one adopts that perspective, follows that formal institutionalized learning about law is only a small, though important part of learning about law from cradle to grave. And this prompts a question: who learns or mislearns about law? When? How? Why? And with what resources? The answer is, of course, everyone. And so the question arises, who's responsible for overviewing the health of such learning? Let me end on a more upbeat note. My reaction to some of the contributions is that the situation in formal legal education is not as depressing as they make out. Yes, Excessive bureaucratization has some real downsides. Funding of higher education generally is in a mess. Problems of gender, race, disability, access, and diversity are still unresolved, and some are getting worse. The fact is that law as a discipline, as David has said, is in a much more healthy state than it was 30 years ago. And its potential is even greater. Collectively, it seems to me that academic lawyers in this country have traditionally been extraordinarily passive, with collective action and leadership weakened by a lack of consensus about details of priorities and short-term aims and methods. Surely we can all agree that law as a discipline is fascinating, socially important, dynamic, and the discipline's problems arise from challenges from the real world rather than being dreamed up in Tony's range of towers. I've said that academic legal profession in England and Wales has traditionally been rather passive about policy and political decisions and financing of legal education. Given time, I would talk about two examples of such passivity. First, in respect of four-year degrees, and second, in terms of acceptance, although the vocationally dominated law student culture. On the first, look at Scotland. And just look historically and sociologically how they've handled the traditional distinction between pass and honours degree. I'm told that in Edinburgh, although my information is a bit out of date, what they typically said, you can choose pass or honours, 3 years or 4 years, but what they typically said and persuaded their students that anyone who takes 3 years is an idiot. And so for a very long time, I don't know how long that continues, nearly everyone aspired to take honours and spend 4 years on their first degree. So it's not impossible. On the second, it's up to the teachers to illuminate and persuade their their students, Freudian slip, about the best choices for them. For that to happen, the teachers should believe in the potential of their enterprise. And then they should communicate their enthusiasm, whatever it's about, to persuade and educate their students to make good choices and informed choices. The main mantra for this is catch them young. That's a whole other story. Thank you.